Okay, so here we go. Samachet Beis, about a third of the way down. Ashkechan Kohenes. So we've derived that a Kohenes, Bas Kohen, who has relations with a nivel of apostle, would relinquish her ability, would disqualify herself from eating truma. Levia v'Yisraelis min halon. What about Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael, right? Would she be nivel apostle? Also, Kedom Rabbi Amarav. No, so we would say yes, she would be Bas Ubas. Right, the extra letter vav in the word Bas in the pasuk that tells us that if she's nivel, that if a Bas Kohen is nivel apostle law, she can't eat truma. So Ubas, the extra vav. Hachanami Bas Ubas, right? So this comes to tell us that the extra vav comes to include a Bas Yisrael, Bas Levi, that if she's nivel apostle law, then she would not be allowed to eat truma. Subsequently, come on, this seems to only work for Rabbi Akiva, the Darish Vavin, right? So how are you allowed to be Dorish a vav at the beginning of a word to teach you a lesson? Rabbi Akiva, right? He was Dorish the crowns also, right? That's a different Gemara, right? So he was Darish Vavin as a legitimate source of halachic interpretation. So if you take Rabbanon, no, even the Rabbanon, and obviously we wouldn't want it to only work that a Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael is disqualified from Truma because of Nivel Apostle law, based on a drasha that only applies according to Rabbi Kiva. So now we expand that. If you take Rabbanon, Kule Ubas Krayaseru. You don't learn it from the letter Vav in the word Ubas. You learn it from the entire word Ubas. It's an extra word, not an extra letter. And that's a lesson that even the Rabbanon could or do agree to, thereby finding our source for Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael, Nivel, Apostle law is disqualified from Truma. Ashkechan Truma. So now we see that if she a Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael is Nivel Apostle law, she's not allowed to eat Truma subsequently, right? Right. So that case would be, let's say she was married to she was the widow of a Kohen, let's say, right? So she's eating truma, and then she's nivel apostle law, so she can no longer eat truma. What about the kahuna? How do we know that she's now disqualified from marrying a Kohen after nivel apostle law? So atu levia v'Yisraelis lo lakuna marbin amru, right? That should definitely be included. That they not only can they not eat truma subsequently from nivel apostle, but also they can't marry a Kohen. Dila truma, right? It was, if this pasuk was just to tell us that they cannot eat truma, no, it's mechal truma ninu, right? In general, in the absence of any sort of marriage to a Kohen, a Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael is not right to eat truma, right? So since they're not right to eat truma, right, it must be coming to tell us that on a basic level, right, without any complications, on a basic level, it's meant to exclude a nivel apostle from marrying, disqualify. Sorry, a nivel apostle from marrying a Kohen. Alamalo, right? So we're working with faulty reasoning, right? The Gemara in this small part assumes that the obvious case of a Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael disqualification is her disqualification for marrying a Kohen, because in general, a Bas Kohen, Bas Yisrael, most of the way, thanks. A Bas Kohen, Bas Yisrael is generally not able to eat truma, right? She doesn't come from a family of truma eaters. But the Gemara answers already what I had already said, right? So I sort of let the cat out of the bag a little early. Alamalo, right? It's not so far-fetched, right? That you have a case where a Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael is eating truma, in the sense of in the case of she was married already. She was married already to a Kohen, and they had a child, and now she can eat from that based on that. Samach on days, halfway down. So so it's not so it's so bishvil b'na, right? So we need the pasuk to tell us that that she can't, that a Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael, that's a nivel apostle, if she was eating truma due to her son, she loses that right. She relinquishes the right to eat truma based on her Kohen son, if in the interim she's has relations with a person whom she's unfit to marry. So we say no, and therefore we don't know about whether her relations with a apostle would disqualify her from marrying a Kohen later on. So we say no, b'shvil b'na kal v'chomer. You don't need the pasuk to tell us that that nivel apostle would end her ability to eat truma due to her son. Kal v'chomer wasn't kal v'chomer. Ma Kohen has to be kedusha d'nafsha ka'achla. When it comes to a Bas Kohen, right? When she eats truma because of who she is, because of who she's, the family in which she's born. Kedusha d'nafsha. Right? It's kind of interesting. We don't really talk. Where else do we talk about a kohenes, right? We don't talk about priestess, right? It's not really a construct that exists by us, but it does sort of. They don't serve in the Beis Hamikdash, but they have a kedusha d'nafsha. They have a kedusha saguf in certain ways, right? Limited, but certainly available. One of them is that they can, so long as they're not attached to a non-Kohen spouse, they can eat truma, right? So pasula, but so even if so we want to say that it's a kal v'chomer, because when it comes to a Bas Kohen, she's eating truma now because she was born into it. It's a kedusha on her guf. That's who she is. She's a kohenes. And yet, if she's nivel apostula, if she has relations with a man with whom she's not allowed to marry, pasul, right? She's no longer allowed to eat truma, even though that ability to eat truma comes from kedusha saguf. So Levi of Yisrael is the loachla el b'shvil b'na, right? Lo kol shekain. And certainly in the other, when it comes to a Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael, who's only able to, it's not a kedusha saguf, right? The reason why she's allowed to eat now is because she had been married to a Kohen, who, let's say, died. Let's keep it simple, and they had a son together, and that child is eating truma, maybe even a daughter, but certainly a son. Right? That son is enabling her to eat truma, so it's not intrinsic. So since it's not intrinsic, we might say that it's more tenuous, and therefore that could do, if the kedusha saguf of the Bas Kohen doesn't allow her to continue eat truma for nivel apostula, then certainly the ability to eat truma of a Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael is weaker, and therefore is completely removed in the case of nivel apostula. So the Gemara says, okay, that's one way to look at it, but you could look at it in the exact opposite way. Right? The other way would the very strength that you mentioned and weaknesses can also be portrayed in the opposite direction between a Bas Kohen on the one hand and a non-Bas Kohen on the other. Kohenes de Kadesh Gufa, right? Why is the Bas Kohen allowed to eat truma now? Because of her own status, her own sanctity. Well, she has disgraced that sanctity by nivel apostle. Right? If it's her status that allows her to eat truma, then when she soils that status by nivel apostula, that's a real problem. Aha, lo kadosh kufa. But when it comes to the Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael, she's not eating truma because of her kedusha saguf, right? She's eating truma because of her son. Her son, there's no change in status of her son. There is a change in status, one might say, on her kedusha saguf. because of nivel lo pasula, so lo pasula, right? So therefore, there is no kal v'chomer. You can't, because you need to learn it in both places. In other words, you can't say because a Bas Levi is not allowed to is not allowed to marry a Kohen at this point in the Nivel Pasula, then for sure she can't eat truma. No, maybe she could continue to eat truma because the fact that she's eating truma is not a reflection of her kedusha saguf. It's rather a reflection of the of the child that she created with a Kohen, and that hasn't changed, right? So you see that the logic goes both ways. Ela kahuna. So how do we know kahuna in the end, right? How do we know that if you're nivel apostla, then she's not allowed to marry a Kohen, right? Kavachomer migrusha, right? First word on the line is kovav, kavachomer migrusha, right? This is a kavachomer from grusha. We're taking a different tack. From a divorcee, ma grusha shemutaris b'truma asur l'kahuna. Grusha, a woman who's divorced, right, would be allowed, again, a Bas Kohen. If she gets divorced from her non-Kohen spouse, she'll be allowed to once again eat truma, but still asur l'kahuna. But she can't go ahead and marry a Kohen now because a grusha is not, a divorcee is not allowed to marry a Kohen. But she's not allowed to marry a Kohen. She is allowed to eat truma, if that's what she was doing before. Zusha survit truma, then a nivel apostla. Nivel apostla, right, is not allowed to eat truma. Yadin shipsula kuna, right? So if a nivel apostla is not allowed to eat truma, kavachomer, a nivel apostla is not allowed to marry a Kohen. So we're going to ask sort of a technical detail. It's kind of like before we saw the technical detail about, is this according to just Rabbi Akiva or even the Rabbanan? So here we have another technical detail. Can you establish a warning on a lav, right? Namely, the lav of not marrying, of nivel apostle marrying a Kohen. Can you learn that from a kal v'chomer? There are certain rules associated with how you learn Yisurim, lo says negative commandments, and one of them is that you can't learn it out from a kal v'chomer. It has to be explicit or a hekesh. There are other types of things that I can do, but sort of logical deduction is not a legitimate way of deriving a prohibition. We say no, Gilui Milta B'Amaru, right? That's kind of a very typical way of avoiding the issue, right? By saying, no, it's not that we learn it from here. It's not that we're using a kal v'chomer. It's that it reveals a Gilui Milta means it reveals what was there. Let's say as a halacha Moshe Sinai or some other method of determining the yisur. It's not a kal v'chomer. It's a Gilui Milta. Okay, so we have the sources for why nivel apostla, a Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael is not allowed to eat truma and also not allowed to marry a Kohen. So now we want to define
a regular Bas Levi or Yisrael, nothing happened to her. Sular is not allowed to eat truma and she's allowed to marry a Kohen.
Right, so that's why it's the other way around. We're not learning it from those who are allowed to eat. We're learning it from those who are not allowed to eat. Right? By the way, we're talking about eligibility. We're not talking about, right? We're talking about eligibility. So she is eligible to eat. She would just have to marry a Kohen.
Oh, okay.
Right? Yeah. Okay. So now we want to define who are the men with whom she has had relations who are the psulim that qualify into this category of nivel apostle. Nivel apostle chayv krisus. We only talk. Does the relationship have to be with those who are liable for the penalty of kares? Right. Those are like arayos, right? The real close relationships, right? Is that it? So the Gemara says no. It doesn't include them at all. Kisiyah Amar Achmana. The pasuk, when it comes to talking about these cases, says Kisiyah Hanach Isbu Havaya. right? The idea of the word haya when it comes to marriage means someone who is eligible for marriage, right? Hanach disbu havaya, chavi krisus lavne havaya, right? So chavi krisus are not eligible, right? If you do kedushin with your sister, you're not married. So they're dafka those of chavi krisus are not included in nivul apostolate. Yachi, so we say, really, is that true? Right? Perhaps the most common case that this comes up in is by an akum, right? Like, let's say you have a balas tshuva who wants to marry a kohen, right? Sometimes it gets a little dicey. Did she have a girlfriend in high school? Was the girlfriend Jewish or not Jewish? Boyfriend, excuse me, right? Right? Yeah, not for the kohen, right? But right. So what happens in that case, right? So that sometimes it gets a little bit sensitive, but it's not about chayve krisus, it's about akum, right? So they're asking about that. Is that nivul apostolate, right? Why? We often think in our minds that nivul apostolate, the best example is when you have relations with a shegetz, with a non-Jew. But according to the limud we just said, that should not be nivul apostolate, because kedushin is not chal with a shegetz, right? So if there can't be kedushin, if there's no halachic marriage, then you're saying that there's no prohibition, right, of disqualification of nivul apostolate. So we say no, that we're not going to go there. As we say, Yachi over Kochavim David will live. Slu? No, so no. Hanach Pasli, 4 lines from the bottom, 5 lines from the bottom. Hanach Pasli mid Rabbi Yishmael. Tam Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yishmael. Minayin lo Kochavim the Eved Shabbat Bas Yisrael. Right? How do we know that an Ovid Kochavim or an Eved that has relations with the Bas Yisrael, Bal Kohenes Levia, or Bas Kohen Bas Levi Shabbat Slua? That even though kedushin cannot be chal, right? That there's no havaya, that they disqualify her from marrying kohen. Shnamar ubas kohen kisiya almana ugrusha, right? So it connects it to the situation of almana and grusha, right? Mi sheyesh tapas samachtes, mi sheyesh lo almanos gerushin ba, right? Right. This is about which women, which bas Kohens, after their marriage can go back to eating truma. Right. We say those. So we say mishesh lo almanos v'gerushin ba. Those who have those who acquire a status due to their previous relationship of being an almana if the significant if the spouse dies, or gerushin if there's a divorce. Yatsu ovi kochavim ve'eved shein lo almanos v'gerushin. Right. This excludes a guy. Ovi kochavim and eved where there is no almanos, there's no gerushin, there's no kedushin. Right. So it's so there is so what happened to Havaya? It's an added limud. In other words, right, you're right. In general, we say it requires marriage, but it requires marriage where there is almanos and gerushin. And in the case of Evet Kanani, or Goy in general, there is no status afterwards. Right? It doesn't make her eligible to be and since it doesn't allow her to be eligible to almana and grusha status, so it apostles her from truma. Right? Because the only way you could continue to eat truma is if the relationship that you're in would dissolve in gerushin or almana. Since this relationship does not do that, once you've had this relationship with the guy, you're now apostle from truma. That's the limit there.
So marrying one of your krovim also.
Marrying one of your krovim, right? So I was thinking about what happened to the Havaya question. Marrying one of your krovim, kedushin is not chal, and would it be a nivala? It seems like no, it can't. But I don't know what happens to chayve krisus. not 100% sure. That's what I was saying before. I'm not sure what we do with that. What was that?
I think article says it does, I think. I don't understand, I'm not correct.
That it ends in what?
The same token we learn from this verse that those forbidden in marriage under penalty of Kares also disqualify her from Truma, since these two cannot be married to her.
Oh, okay. I mean, it makes sense, right? It makes sense that there's no Almanos of Gerushin. So it's all encompassing. So in other words, even though, so we're rejecting the Kisiya, right? In other words, Kisiya would limit it to only where that the Sul would only be women where there's Kedushin Chal. We're rejecting that altogether with this new word. And when we bring the pasuk of Almana and Grusha, we're saying that if there's no Almana and Grusha status, whether it's because you had relations with a guy or relations with a Chayv Krisos, the end result's going to disqualify you from truth. Okay. Now that's good. So what happened to the answer is what happened to Havaya? It seems like we've moved on from Havaya. That's no longer the organizing principle. It doesn't have to be able to be Havaya in order for there to be a psul, a nivel apostle. Ashkelon Kohenes. So this works by the Kohen Bas Kohen herself. Levi of Israel is Minalan. How do we know the Israel? So this is going to be the same Gemara we just saw earlier. Kedamar Rav Ama Amarav. Bas Ubas, right? Added letter Vav. Hachanami Bas Ubas. Kaman, Krabi Kiva, Dedarsh Vavin. No, Afil Tim Rabbanon. I'm doing this quick because we sort of did this already. Kula Ubas, Kraiserahu. It's not the letter Vav, it's the whole word Ubas. Fine. It even works according to the Chachamim. Vehema. Right, so let's say Misheyesh Lo Almanos Gerushin Ba. Right. Let's say those who are those where the relationship is eligible for becoming an almana and a grusha. Kiles le'zera kachlu. Right. If there is no children, right, she may eat truma. Ki is le'zera lo kachla. Right. Then when if there is a child, then she can't eat truma, right? Right, a child created from this relationship, right? With the shegets, right? That's what we're talking about.
Because the child is proving that they're having relations?
No, hold on a second. Bishesh Lamanos of Gerushin Law, right? Right, when she no, this is a Bas Kohen, I'm sorry. Right, Bas Kohen. Right? Bas Kohen who's married, right? And where it could end in widowhood or divorce. Kiles le'zera, right? When there are no children, right? If she married, let's say she married Yisrael, right? So her kids are Yisrael. If there are no children, she can go back to eating truma, back to her father's house. Kiles le'zera lo achla. But we might say if there is a child, she may not eat truma. And mishen lo almanos gerushin ba, and if she has relations with, let's say, a shegetz, right? Afalgav the islezera nami techo, right? So there's kind of a kula, right? As Rashi says, because that child is considered to be like a behema. We talked about that once before. That right? There's no yichus on the side of non-Jews, right? Technically speaking, a child born of a Jewish mother, non-Jewish father, right, should be called up to the Torah by his mother's name. Right? Out of a sense of, sensitivity, we allow him to be called up by his grandfather's name, his mother's father's name. But technically speaking, he has no yichus on his father's side. So, right, so that would be a kula. If she married, if she had a real relationship, right, then the child invalidates her. We saw that's the mission at the beginning. The child is posel her from eating truma. But if she has a child with a shegitz, she could go back to eating truma. That's kind of interesting, right? That would be weird. So no. Imkain ribuye levia v'Yisrael lamali. Right? If that was the case, then why would you need to include if a Kohen, a Bas Kohen, who has a child with a shegitz, is allowed to eat truma due to the child, then you wouldn't need to include Levi and Yisraelis, right? Because if it applies, if there's this huge kula, this huge heter for a Bas Kohen, then there's certainly a kula for a Bas Levi and Bas Yisrael, right? So it can't be.
She eats truma because she's connected to her father, not good, and that's the reason. And it's not that she's connected to her the father of her child. So since she's not connected to the father of her child, the connection to her father, that the child doesn't disrupt that connection to her father.
Child does not disrupt, right?
But the question is, could she marry a
Kohen?
Kohen?
Right. We might see that. We might see that coming up. She probably could not marry a Kohen. My guess is she can't marry a Kohen, right? She's Nivel Apostle. The fact that she can, right? The fact that she can continue to eat truma is because we sort of say there's no, the current status, because she was always allowed to eat truma, right?
Right. She didn't break this. She's still connected to her father.
Right. Correct. So we say imke fine. Imke Rabbi Levi says Amalio or Rabbi Kiva. According to Rabbi Kiva, Damar Ein Kedushin Tosin B'chai Lavin. Oh, so is this new? Yeah, I think that's the end of that piece. Right, Imkain. Let's look at Rashi. Imkain, this long Rashi. Imkain, first wide line. Imkain the high crowd lekulaksiv, lashmina dezera dovi kochavim vevid lo pasel. Right, if the child that a Bas Kohen has with a shegitz would be a kula and allow her to eat truma, ribui levia v'Yisrael is tekasav be'lamali, tekasav ubas kvayisera. Why would you need an extra word? Why would you need a limud about a Levi Bas Yisrael? Hashta Kohenes Gufa. Ashmiina Delo Mifsala Bezera Ovi Kochavim Ve'eved. If a Bas Kohen who has relations with an Ovi Kochavim is not disqualified through that child eating Shuma, Levi Yisrael is mibayeh. Right? So yes, you're right. It's not glut. I agree with you. Right, the idea that there's a kal v'chomer to be learned from here, because the Bas Kohen is falling back to her original status. Right. Let's see what he goes on to say. V'im yishum lashmina demi sheyesh lo amos gerushin afilu hachi ki itzla zera minei v'teichal v'tzrich l'meisar l'viv Yisraelis hochelas b'truva b'shvil b'na Kohen. Right. T'chitirasi lazar ve'la zera mimenu. Lo chashiv l'truma v'yisas bala. Pshitalan, right? So to tell us that a woman, Levi Bas Yisrael, married to a Kohen, has a child who's a Kohen, and then that relationship is dissolved, so that she could still eat truma. Pshitalan, the cave of the Kohen is gufa mipsal v'zera Yisrael. Truma de Beinasha, Kolsha Ken Yisraelis Ochelas B'Shvil B'na. Right? So to tell us that the Bas Kohen, so the situation is where a Bas Levi Bas Yisrael has a child with a Kohen and was eating Truma through that child, and then is Nivel Apostle. That's the sushta, right? Right. That's the comparison. And then we go back to the whole idea of Kedusha, that if we're saying that the Bas Kohen, who has a stronger claim to eating Truma, right, because of the fact that she was born into it, and she loses that, right, that's the Kal V'chomer, and she loses that due to Nivell Apostle law, right? So certainly the Bas Levi, Bas Yisrael, who's only eating Truma because of her child, who's a Kohen, that certainly is lost due to Nivell Apostle law. Okay. Fine. So new piece. So Rabbi Akiva. So we first said Nivell Apostle law is Chayve Krisos. We said maybe we actually reject that because you don't need. It's not only Chayve Krisos; it's beyond that. Rabbi Akiva Domer Ein Kedushin Tosim Chayve Lavin. What according to Rabbi Akiva holds that Kedushin is not Chal on Chayve Lavin, right? My Kitiya Leishzar. What does it mean that a Kitiya, that a Bas Kohen is Leishzar, right? Because the problem is, an Ishzar, we're assuming is someone who she's not allowed to marry due to a Chiyav Lav. But according to Rabbi Akiva, Chiyav Lav does not create Ishus. If it doesn't create Ishus, why does it say Kisiya? Kisiya is a language of betrothal, right? So we say, no, it doesn't mean Kisiya. Kisiya here means Kitibayel. It's just that they cohabited. It's not that they created any sort of halachic framework for that. Amano Grusha Lamali. So why, if Kisiya means that there was no actual relationship, then what how does it talk about an Amana Grusha? Amana Grusha is only the after effect of a real halachically sanctioned or recognized betrothal marriage, right? So the Gemara answers Amana lahachmir ugrusha lahachmir, right? So we're going to see what this what this means. But basically, an Amana where she has children from the dead husband, and a Grusha where she doesn't have children. So let's see. Tzricha Yashmin and Amana. If we had only mentioned the Almana hu dechi lesle zera achla, I would have said that only only an Almana, if she has no children, a Bas Kohen Almana is allowed to eat Truma. Because if she's an Almana, she can go ahead and get married again to a Kohen, right? We might think that a Bas Kohen, once she gets married to Yisrael, no longer is affiliated with her family, father's household, right? And the only reason why she could, and in general, she may not be allowed to eat Truma. The only reason why she's allowed to eat Truma is if she's an Almana, because then she could eat Truma because she's eligible to marry a Kohen, right? But aval grusha do chazil lakuna im aval gav delesla zera lo achlo. We might have said that the original marriage to a non-Kohen completely separates herself from her father's home. The divorce makes it that she can't eat truma because she's no longer associated with her father's home, and she's no longer eligible to marry a Kohen in the future. So it comes to tell us, it mentions grusha to tell us that even if her Bas Kohen's marriage ended in divorce, she, as long as there's no kids, she could go back to her father's home to eat truma. Is that true? If she has kids, she can't eat truma. Is that true? If a Bas Kohen has children from a non-Kohen, they get divorced, let's say. Can she then eat truma from her father's house? I don't think so.
No, because she's forever connected to the new husband. Right. Not the new husband, to the
previous husband,
severed husband.
Right.
Yeah, ex-husband.
Right. Okay, good. V'yashmin and grusha. If the pasuk had just said grusha dichi isle zera lo achla. If a grusha has a child, right, then she can't eat truma from her father's household. Mishum delo chazil lakuna. Avalmana chazil lakuna. Right. a widow who could get married to a Kohen, and that's what I was thinking in my head. So tricha. So right. So the child of a Bas Kohen and a Yisrael completely severs her ability to eat truma thereafter, right? But a grusha who doesn't have children, right? The chiddush is that she could go back to eat truma from her father's house, right? So the child is more of a right. Child is more of a koveya, that she's no longer part of the Kohen's household than a divorce without children. The nivel apostla af machzir grushaso. Right. So now we're trying to understand who are the men with whom she's having these relationships with that are nivel apostla. That brings her into this question of whether she can eat truma or marry a Kohen. Really, truma is mostly the issue here. What if she's machzir her grusha, right? Garush, right? She was married to A, she got divorced, she married B, got divorced, married A again. We know you're not allowed to do that. It's a pasuk in Chumash. But if you do it, Kedushin Schal. Right? That's how we know Rabbi Akiva is wrong, right? It's a love, but Kedushin Schal. So would that be Nivel Apostala? Right? Would that disqualify her? Let's say the second husband died. Right? That's better. Right? The second husband died, and then and now she's married again. Right? Let's say to a Kohen. Right? So Leisha Marachmana. The Gemara says no. The pasuk addresses it. Leisha Zar. Misha Zar Etzlo Meikara. Hi, the Zar Etzlo Meikara. This would not be a case in the apostle, because the pasuk talks about an Ish Zar, and this guy's not an Ish Zar. She was married to him once before. So that is not that's not Nivul Apostle. So it's a technicality in the law. Ihachi. So we ask if that's the case. Chalal delav zarhu meikara lo lafso. A chalal, right? Someone who's ineligible, who for some reason, right, was the child, let's say, of a Kohen in a divorce, right? Divorcee, right? So he's a chalal. So should that also not disqualify her? And we want to say machzir grusha, so it's not an issue because he's not a zar. But a chalal is not a zar either. A chalal is a perfectly Jewish person. They just have yichus problems, right? So we say makish zarolo. Right? The Torah compares makish zarolo. Makish zaro shel Kohen Gadol, Rashi says, mino monolo. We compare the child of a Kohen Gadol from an almana to this one. Mahu posel almana b'biyaso min truma. Right? Okay, so the deal is this case of a chalal married to a let's say a Bas Kohen is similar to a Kohen Gadol the case of a chalal to the case of a Kohen Gadol who has a child from an almana, let's say. Mahu posel, right? just as the Kohen Gadol himself, right? Apostles the woman from eating truma. Avzaronami posel. So too the child born of this relationship would apostle the woman from eating truma. Right. So the child, if a woman has if a right, so just as the Kohen, the relationship between the Kohen and the woman, Kohen Gadol and the woman, apostles her because he was not allowed to marry her. Right, it's not a valid relationship. So to any child that's born of that would invalidate her from eating truma. Ve'ema mishas havaya. Does it maybe because we put so much weight in already earlier to havaya kisiya, that there has to be eligible for betrothal. So what if maybe it's from the time of betrothal and not the time of bia? And we know that it's a process. Maybe havaya is enough. Do me the Kohen Gadol b'almana? No, we say that they all have to be comparable to the case of a Kohen Gadol who has a connection with an almana. Ma Kohen Gadol b'almana b'bia. The problem with the Kohen Gadol invalidates the almana with cohabitation, not with betrothal. So avhai nami b'bia. It has to actually reach the point of intimacy. It's not enough that there's a betrothal. At that point, she would not be disqualified. Vema adika havaya ubia. Maybe you need both, right? Intimacy would not be enough. Betrothal would not be enough. Maybe you need both in order to disqualify her for nivul apostle. Do me the Kohen Gadol b'almana? No. Ma Kohen Gadol b'almana b'via l'chuda. Afnami b'via l'chuda. Right. So bia is really the issue. It has to be someone who's eligible for havaya, but technically speaking, there doesn't have to be a betrothal or kedushin as part of the process. Bia alone is enough. Okay. Back to that original brisa way back when. Rabbi Yossi Omer Kol Shazar Apostle Posel. Right? Anyone whose children are not allowed to eat truma, they also I'm sorry, the relationship between anyone whose child would become pasul also posels the woman from eating truma. And if the child created would not be disqualified, it would not be a problematic child. So then the woman does not become right. So the best example of this would be like an Ashes Ish, a Bas Kohen who has relations with a married man, right? So the child becomes a mamzer. So if the child becomes a mamzer, then the woman is disqualified from eating truma. That's a very obvious one. For Ma'ika ben Tanakam Rabbi Yossi, what's the real difference between the Tanakam and Rabbi Yossi? So Rabbi Yochanan, Mitzri Sheni Radomi Sheni Yikabanan. Right? Let's say she has relations with a Mitzri whose parents converted, right? So we know it's 3 generations before they're really accepted. Or the same thing with an Adomi, right? So according to the Tanakama, that's a prohibited relationship, and therefore she is pasul from truma. According to Rav Yossi, we're going to say no, because the children of that relationship would be okay. Mutar lavo b'kal Hashem. So we would say that that relationship would not invalidate the woman from truma. Both of them learn it from comparing it to a Kohen Gadol to an almana. Right? Tanakama holds ma Kohen Gadol b'almana sheviyaso bavero posel. Kohen Gadol has relations with an almana. Right? He's only allowed to marry a virgin. So if he has relations with an almana, right, his relations were aser, were bavera, and he posel, right, and she's not allowed to eat truma. So afhainami posel, right? So it's about the It's about the bia. It's the bia that disqualifies, right? So if the bia was prohibited, then the woman's disqualified from truma. That's the Tanakama. Right? So the second generation Adomi Mitzri who have already converted, they're not allowed to come to Kal Hashem, right? And that already invalidates her. Rabbi Yossi Sover, Kohen Gadol, right? We look at the Kohen Gadol, Ma Kohen Gadol, Shezaro, Pasul, Posel, right? A Kohen Gadol who with an almana, right? They have children. Those children are posel, right? And it also disqualifies, right? It's not. We look at the big picture, right? The big picture. We look at the fact that the big picture is that Kohen Gadol to an almana. Not only does she disqualify, but her children are pasul, and that's the only scenario in which she's pasul. She's pasul. She's disqualified from eating truma because her children are pasul. That's what Rabbi Yossi says. So Avkol, Shezaro pasul. It's a big kula, right? Right. Rabbi Yossi says the only time a woman is pasul from eating truma is if the child created from that union would also have problematic lineage, right? So Almana Kohen Gadol has both facets, right? Or maybe, as Rabbi Yossi would say, because an Almana and Kohen Gadol create a chalal, right? So that's why she can't eat truma. But in the case of a second generation Adomi Mitzri married to a woman, their child is perfectly okay, and therefore, even though she wasn't supposed to live with them, we don't look at the bia, we look at the offspring. Of course, and we know that because banim asher yivodu lehem dor shlishi yavo lehem b'kal Hashem. Right, so we know that from there. Okay, one last one before the Mishnah. Shimon Gamliel Omer kol shatanose bito atanose almanaso. Shimon Gamliel says, if you have a daughter that's allowed to marry a Kohen, right? If someone's daughter is allowed to marry a Kohen, then you're not allowed to marry. You're allowed to marry that person's widow, right? So a Bas Yisrael, Bas Yisrael that's allowed to get married, then obviously the widow of that Yisrael is also allowed to be married, right? Because that otherwise the Bas Yisrael would have problematic yichus. Right, so Ma'ik Rabbi Yossi or Shimon Gamliel. What's the difference between Rabbi Yossi or Shimon Gamliel? Amar Ula, Ger Amoni Umavi Kavanayu, right? An Amon Umavi convert is the difference, right? Right? So we're going to see how this plays out. Right, so the Tanakama would say, I'm sorry, Rabbi Yossi would say, this is a problem because the sons, right? That's the difference between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Gamliel. You look at the sons or you look at the daughters. Right? Rabbi Yossi says you look at the sons. The sons of an Ammon Moavi convert are still problematic. They're still Ammon Moavi. Ammon Moavi b'Kal Hashem. Right? But we're going to see if it's a daughter, right? So long as even if the son would be a problem, the daughter wouldn't be a problem. So we're saying that the woman who married this Ammon Moavi convert would not be disqualified from truma. So Shnei Lamdu El Kohen Gadol V'Almana, right? Rabbi Yossi Savar Ma Kohen Gadol V'Almana Shezaro Pasul Posel. Rabbi Yossi looks at the fact that it's the zera, the offspring, whether it's a son or daughter, right, is pasul, is a chalal or chalola, right, and therefore the almana to Kohen Gadol, the woman can't eat. Avkol shezaro pasul posel. But Rav Shimon Gamliel says, Ma Kohen Gadol ba'almana shekol zaro pasul posel. Right, Rav Shimon Gamliel says no. The only time the relationship creates a disqualification of the woman eating truma is if all the offspring, both males and females, are considered to be disqualified. Then that relationship disqualifies the woman from eating truma. Avkol shekol zaro pasul posel. It has to be a case where both sons and daughters, right, are disqualified in some way, and therefore the mother of them is disqualified. Fugemo Moavi, Dein Kol Zaro Pasul, right? The children, not all the children of a union between a woman and an Ammoni and a Moavi are considered to be disqualified. Damar Ammoni, V'lo Ammonis, famously from the book of Ruth, right? Moavi, V'lo Moavis. And therefore, since there are some offspring that it would be okay, so therefore she's not completely disqualified, right? So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is the most expansive in his heter, right? He has a very limited, he has the most limited number of cases where the woman would be nivel apostala. Rabbi Yossi a few more, and the Tanakhama even more. But of course, that last piece is very famous as the